All right, welcome everybody. I hope you enjoyed your cookie break as much as I did. Here we're going to have Cooper Thompson discussing managing changes in a FHIR on a production server.
All right, thank you. So yeah, talking about our process for managing changes and the sorts of changes that we see. So I guess to start with, who am I? So I'm Cooper Thompson. I'm an integration engineer at Epic. And while I'm involved in standards development, my day job is helping our customers design, deploy, and troubleshoot and support FHIR integrations. And so we have, 74 billion API calls in the last year, around 10,000 live FHIR integrations in production. And so there's a lot of support that goes into that. But when we talk about changes, the first thing I want to do is define what I mean by a change or a breaking change. So in the FHIR core specification, there's this definition, which is any change that causes a conformant resource to no longer be conformant. And I think that's a good definition for the spec, but I'm going to focus on a little bit different of a definition. So my definition that I'll focus on is any change that causes a disruption or a failure of an integration such that a human's affected. And so this definition is obviously like a lot broader, and it involves changes to both the FHIR specification itself, but also the software systems that implement that FHIR spec. And it could also include things like workflow changes. And one of the ways I think about the sorts of changes that we deal with is kind of like there's this pyramid, right, where the top of the food chain is core spec authors. So as we go from R4 to R5 to R6, that's a pretty infrequent activity. And in the grand scheme of things, there aren't that many changes that happen across the major versions of FHIR. There's a lot of IGs and a lot of IG authors. There's even more server developers and server operators. And I've also separated out server developers and operators because I find that helpful to think about Epic, we're a server developer, but we deliver our software to our health centers and they install that and run it. And so they're the ones that are operating that server. And then similarly for app developers and app operators. I do acknowledge that for many systems, the operator and developer may be the same organization, but in some cases they're separate. And then at the bottom we have end users, right? And that could be patients, it could be nurses, call center staff, any end user that's using a system that gets data through FHIR. So even though I said I'm not going to talk about FHIR core spec changes that much, the first example I want to talk about is a change in the FHIR core spec. So in this case, the encounter resource has this class property. And in R4, it was a one-to-one cardinality with coding data type, specific value set. And that was changed pretty significantly in R5. So the cardinality was different, the data type was different, the value set was different, and the binding strength was different. So the only thing that really stayed the same was the class, was the actual name of the property. But I say this, it takes time and effort for us to deal with, but we'll assign a developer when we move to R5 or R6. They'll work through the changes and they'll apply those. But since since major version advancement is so infrequent, this isn't actually a lot of effort for us. Another interesting example that I use a lot is changes for US core, or in general IGs. So in this example, in US core 3.1.1, the condition onset property was pretty unconstrained. So server developers could choose any of these options for representing the onset. Just spoiler, we chose to use onset period for representing condition onset in our server. But then US core 6.1.0 came along and they added that must support flag to the date time option. Now from a FHIR core spec perspective, this isn't a breaking change, right? So if you have an instance beforehand that uses period, that instance is still valid. But from a server perspective, this could be a problem. And for us, this was a pretty drastic change because we are a resource producer. We collect data from end users and present that as FHIR resources. And so the software we wrote to do that represents the onset as period. And that means every instance of a condition in our server had that onset, was using onset period rather than onset date time, which meant that we didn't meet this must support requirement. So we had a few options for how we handle this. One is we can always write a JIRA against the spec and say, hey, US core, can you maybe make an option for onset period instead? We didn't do that in this case. We could just mock one instance of a resource that uses onset date time, just to kind of check the box, the conformance box for that must support requirement. But that's not exactly, it doesn't feel like a good faith implementation of that. Like if we felt we wanted to add must support in US core, there presumably was a reason. We could say, okay, historical data will use onset period, but future data will use the onset date time. And that means, going forward, we'll meet that requirement across the board. But this has a few challenges. Like one, if we have an app that's like written software to evaluate condition onset, they'll have to check both properties over time, right? So if they want to look at old data, they'll have to look at onset period. New data, they'll have to look at onset date time. And then this is kind of an implementation detail for us, but since we are Facade, we would have to have similar if-else logic to say, hey, if this is old data, present that in FHIR using period data type. So what we ended up choosing to do was just change everything from period to date time. And so this is a change we made as a server, but we had to, when we make that change, we have to tell all of the apps that are using that API, hey, be ready for this change, right? So if you've written software as an app to query our API and you're parsing out the onset period, that won't be there anymore. And now you have to be prepared to look at onset date time instead. So I'm going to go through a few other examples. So one example is of a change that we've made as a developer that impacts those below us. This isn't an implementation guide change, is moving data, in this case, between resources. So today, we allow app developers to query for a patient's preferred pronoun using an observation API. Like they can search for observations, and one of those will be the patient's preferred pronoun. But we're looking at moving that to an extension on the patient resource to align with upcoming US core and US CDI changes. So this is a change that an app developer will have to deal with because if they've written code to search for observations to get pronouns, that won't be there anymore. Another example, and this one's going to be interesting, is list ordering. So in the early days of FHIR, our initial stab at the patient resource, we included several patient identifiers. And it just so happens that the first identifier in that list was the primary MRN that's used by most healthcare organizations. And we saw that some developers actually were like, okay, well, we see that the primary MRN is the first element in the list. Let's write code to yank that out, show it to the end user, or do whatever we want to do with it. And that worked great until it didn't. Because we updated our API to add a new identifier, in this case, the STU3 FHIR ID, and we put that at the top. Now, whether putting it at the top was a good idea or bad, like we thought, oh, it shouldn't matter. But this actually disrupted some apps that were saying, hey, we're expecting the primary MRN to be the first identifier on the list. And if you're thinking like, oh, hey, obviously this is super weird. Like if an app developer is looking for just the first thing in the list, they kind of deserve what's coming to them. Like that's not going to work, right? We know in this room that we should be checking like the system and scanning through that list. But I kind of want to emphasize like it's not really a blame game. Like if an app developer is not the one that suffers the pain of that issue, right? It's the nurses or call center staff that are using the app when it's broken. And so we've actually kind of, I think, realized that talking about robust or well-developed apps is not exactly helpful because every developer is a newbie at some point. Everyone makes mistakes, and there's a lot of incorrect assumptions in healthcare. And all software has bugs. And I'm especially interested in convincing everyone here that we should be lenient on folks because of software bugs, because we actually have some bugs in our system too. And so one example of a breaking change that we had to make was because we were just fixing a bug. We were returning an OID as the code system, and it turns out the FHIR spec says we should be returning a URL. So we fixed it, right? That's the right thing to do. But any apps that were integrating with us that had written code to say, oh, Epic, known issue, but we got to get live, let's write code to accommodate that problem. And so they're parsing the resource looking for that OID. We had to let them know, hey, we're going to change that. We're going to fix it by start using the URL. And so those apps need to update their software to accommodate that change, even though they were initially just looked for that OID because it was a workaround to a problem. Some other fun examples of the sorts of changes we deal with is just new data showing up in the API. So this is a little bit contrived, but pretend that you're doing an observation search for all observations the patient has. And normally you expect to see like, say, 30 different results. And you present those to the screen to like, say, a nurse, and that's the information the nurse is expecting to see, and they can find the data they're interested in, and that's great. And then Epic, we release a new update to our software such that now genomic data is included in our observation API. And now all of a sudden there's like, 1,000 or more genomic variant observations in that result set. And like this is very clear, like not a breaking change from a FHIR spec perspective, right? Like this is kind of expected. This is what we anticipate happens when more data is available in the API. But this can actually be sort of a challenge from a user experience perspective. Like if you think about Google, if the result you're interested in is on the first page of Google, like that's great. If it's on the 10th page of Google, that's broken from a user experience perspective. So if nurses are having to now scroll through 10 pages of data to get to the vital or lab result they're interested in, like that's broken from a user experience perspective. And this can happen because EHR, like we as an EHR make software changes, but also just like operational changes. Like if you have a health system that is live on, has some outpatient clinics, and they're collecting vitals a couple times throughout the course of a visit, then you'll not have that many vitals for a given patient. But then if they go live with like a new surgical center that's using the same platform, then and that patient has a surgery where they're collecting vital, blood pressure every 15 minutes or something, then you can have a lot more data. And so even just like going live with a surgical center can impact the amount of data that shows up in the API, which can impact the behavior of some types of app integrations. And then one final example is kind of mapping changes. So this I think of as like configuration changes that health systems can make. So in this example, say that a healthcare organization has a bunch of note types. Their physicians write various types of notes, and one of them is a progress note. And for their attending progress notes, they initially mapped that to the link code for attending progress notes. So if an app wants that data, they'll query for any notes that have that specific link code. But then the health system's like, oh, US Core is adopting this other link code for just generic progress note. So let's fix that mapping or change that mapping such that those notes which previously were categorized as an attending progress note are now categorized as just a generic progress note. And like you could argue, well, okay, maybe we should add a second mapping, but I mean, in some cases it might make sense to change. And so if that mapping gets changed, that changes how data shows up in the API. So if apps had written software that either written software or had configuration options that determined what link codes were being searched on, that mapping change in our system could impact the data that that app is getting. So in terms of like, well, lots of examples, what is it that we do to address this? So it's like process, right? So anytime we're making a change, we'll write that down in design, we'll get stakeholders to review that, and we'll say, hey, can we make this change in a way that's less impactful to the apps that that are using our APIs? And very often we can make, we try really hard not to make breaking changes, but sometimes like that's the only option, or sometimes that's the best thing to do. And so in those cases, we have a breaking change review process where we have experts that are used to dealing with, that have seen like the full spectrum of ways that apps can break. And they'll kind of look at the change that we're making and say, okay, do we need to notify all of the app developers of this change? And I've showed a few examples of that notification email that we send to folks that are using APIs that we're making changes to. So the next step in the process is for the app developers, right? They have to receive that notification, read it, understand it, figure out how that affects them, or if that affects them, and then make software updates to accommodate that change. And then somehow they need to deploy that change to if it's a patient app, just deploy it in their app ecosystem, or if it's an app used by a health system, they'll have to maybe provide that software update to that health system so that the health system can regression test. And so the final step in this process is kind of on the health system side, as kind of the product operator. And so anytime we make a change, pretty much for our entire product, we'll let our health systems know about that, so that in this case, like for API changes, they can ensure that the app developer has received the notification, has updated their software, and coordinate the installation and deployment of those software updates. And then, especially for any app that is mission critical or important, run it through regression testing in their non-prod environments before they promote that to production. So that kind of, that three-step process for the stuff that we do, stuff that app developers do, and then stuff that our health systems do, that's kind of how we handle all these sorts of changes that can happen that can impact how apps behave when APIs change. So kind of to close, managing breaking changes is kind of a balancing act, right? We could forbid breaking changes, but if we do that, then we can't make fixes and enhancements or allow config changes, or I suppose we would prohibit health systems from going live with a surgical center somehow. I don't know. So really, like, breaking changes are things that we deal with a lot in our API. They can be driven by a lot of different motivators. And it's really like a question of cost benefit. Like, if someone is making a breaking change, usually there's some benefit that they hope to realize, but that adds cost to the whole ecosystem. But I think it's reasonable that we have to expect constant iteration of APIs. And so we really need a process and plan. And so I kind of talked about our process and plan, and that's something that, other folks might want to consider too. So that gets us right on time to questions.
Yeah, Coop, I think the question is like, for example, any breaking change. For example, the example you say, the US call some change, there's fundamental change, but do you like make a different version of the APIs to coexist to like, so that at least some period for transition over, instead of like just like a big bang approach? Okay, tomorrow I'm going to make change, all have to change.
So we have just like we have FHIR version endpoints, so we just have one R4 endpoint. We don't have a different endpoint for different IG versions. And I know at least one other EHR does do that. So I think that practice varies. And so we do kind of do like hey, when you move from this version to this version of Epic, of our API, you'll have one API endpoint that will change, and the behavior behind that will change. So, to your answer, we don't really have, we have some, we try to build in some transition period when possible, but it kind of depends on what the change is as to whether that's possible or not.
Okay. The follow-up question is just now one of the change you mentioned about, say, for example, like the onset period, change the onset date time. For example, like you say, at a certain point onwards, you will all change to onset date. But how about, do you also patch the previous date, the data?
Yeah, so in this case, I think we were only collecting a single onset date, and so we chose period, I think, to say, well, if we in the future enhance our software to like collect an onset date range, we have the ability to easily, so we kind of used our crystal ball and used our crystal ball to guess what we might need in the future, so we chose period, but we didn't actually need it. So in that case, since we only captured a single date, we didn't lose data when we moved to onset date time.
So I know with like Epic, you guys deploy like on premises with your customers. And so like when these updates go out, do they generally like, will all those different sites get updated at the same time, or does it depend when they take the updates? Like if an app is connected with multiple sites, there could be different times the sites are updated, or are there issues there?
Yep, so that's exactly right. So, and there's like, I think 2 different axes of like, I'll say consistency here. One is like, each of our customers upgrade on their own timelines and deploy software updates on their own timelines. So like all apps that integrate with a single customer, like they'll all advance at one time. But yeah, if you're an app like a patient-facing app that's connecting to dozens or hundreds of different health systems, you'll have to like build in logic to handle that transition because they can happen at different times. And I understand that's challenging.
Are there things that we should be doing when we publish IGs that we're not going to surface everything because we change 3 words in a textual description somewhere that have massive ramifications, and tooling is just not smart enough to know that. But there's a bunch of stuff that you shared that I think tooling could identify potentially. Are there things that we can or should be doing from a publishing perspective that would help either A, identify, or B, make the manual review process that will inevitably be necessary a little bit more efficient to help identify that these are the ramifications of what we have done, so that we can maybe have some sober second thought about, is it worth it? But also that if, yes, we decide that it is worth it, the people who are downstream and need to take into account what's happened can do that better.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like maybe a cost benefit in there. So like, I think like, you know, being able to see an easy diff of what's changed between versions can, you know, make it a little easier. But honestly, like our process is usually comparing like the software that we've written against the new version. And so in some sense, what was in the old version is not, like, that's not the basis of comparison we use. So I can certainly imagine that being valuable for folks that are just doing IG version to IG version comparison. But ultimately, we're doing our software to target IG version comparison. So I don't want to say no, but also like that won't significantly reduce the work. It may help a little bit. Yeah.
That's all the time we have for questions. Thank you, Cooper.